Your Honor, my wife is mentally unstable, Kevin declared to the packed courtroom, his voice carrying that practiced tone of concerned authority that had fooled so many people for so many years. She's been documenting our private conversations, taking secret recordings, and frankly, I fear for our daughter's safety living with someone so paranoid and delusional. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded calmly in my lap, watching my husband of 15 years paint me as the unhinged woman he'd spent the last 3 years convincing everyone I was. What Kevin didn't know was that every single word he'd just spoken was about to backfire in ways he couldn't imagine. The judge's reaction to the evidence I was about to present would strip away everything Kevin believed he owned, everything he thought he'd built, and reveal the truth he'd worked so desperately to hide. My name is Lisa Martinez, and until 18 months ago, I genuinely believed I was losing my mind. For 3 years, my husband Kevin had been systematically convincing me that my memory was failing, that I was becoming increasingly irrational, and that my perceptions of reality couldn't be trusted. It started small, as these things always do. A conversation about dinner plans that he swore never happened. Important documents that mysteriously disappeared from where I'd left them. Appointments he claimed I'd forgotten to mention, leaving him scrambling to reschedule his busy real estate development meetings. I was a registered nurse for 12 years before I gave up my career to support Kevin's growing business and raise our daughter, Sophie. In the ICU, attention to detail wasn't just important, it was literally life and death. I was trained to notice patterns, to document everything meticulously, and to trust my observations even under extreme stress. But somehow, in my own home, I began doubting the very instincts that had saved countless lives in the hospital. The morning that would change everything started like any other Wednesday in our Westlake Hills home. Sophie had already left for school, and Kevin was getting ready for what he called the biggest presentation of his career, to potential investors for his latest luxury development project near Lake Travis. I was in our kitchen, preparing his usual coffee and reviewing the grocery list I'd written the night before, when Kevin came downstairs wearing a suit I'd never seen before. "Nice suit," I commented, genuinely admiring the charcoal gray fabric. "Is it new?" Kevin paused at the kitchen island, his expression shifting to that familiar look of patient concern that always made my stomach clench. "Lisa, we talked about this suit last week. You helped me pick it out at Nordstrom, remember? You said the navy one made me look washed out." I stared at him, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. I had no memory of shopping for suits with Kevin recently. In fact, I distinctly remembered him refusing my offer to help him shop, saying he preferred to handle his wardrobe himself. But the certainty in his voice, the gentle way he said my name like he was speaking to someone fragile, made me question my own recollection. "Right," I said quietly, though the word felt wrong in my mouth. "Sorry, I guess I'm still not fully awake." Kevin moved around the island and placed his hands on my shoulders, his thumbs rubbing small circles, like he was comforting a child. "Sweetheart, this is exactly what I've been worried about. These memory lapses are getting more frequent. Maybe it's time we talk to Dr. Foster about adjusting your medication?" Dr. Amanda Foster was the therapist Kevin had insisted I start seeing 6 months earlier when my episodes, as he called them, became more frequent. Episodes where I would insist something had happened one way, only to be gently corrected by Kevin and sometimes even Sophie, who would reluctantly agree with her father's version of events. Dr. Foster had been kind, but professional, asking probing questions about my stress levels and suggesting that major life changes, like leaving my nursing career, could manifest in unexpected ways. "I don't think it's the medication," I replied, stepping slightly away from Kevin's touch. Something about the way he was looking at me felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate why. "I've been taking it exactly as prescribed." Kevin sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of a man bearing an impossible burden. "I know you think you have, but yesterday I found 3 pills on the bathroom counter. You'd forgotten to take them again." I felt the familiar cold dread wash over me. I was obsessively careful about my medication, taking it at the same time every morning with my first cup of coffee. I would have noticed 3 missed pills. But Kevin sounded so certain, so concerned, and he had no reason to lie about something so easily verifiable. "I should get going," Kevin said, checking his expensive watch. "This presentation could set us up for life, Lisa. The investors are flying in from Dallas specifically to see our Lake Travis proposal." He kissed my forehead with the practiced affection of a devoted husband. "Try to have a good day, okay? Maybe call Dr. Foster if you're feeling confused about anything else." After Kevin left, I stood in our pristine kitchen surrounded by the trappings of our successful life and felt more alone than I ever had as a single woman. The granite countertops gleamed under the recessed lighting, the stainless steel appliances hummed efficiently, and everything was in its designated place. This house was supposed to represent our American dream achieved, but lately it felt more like an elegant prison where I couldn't trust my own thoughts. I walked upstairs to our master bedroom and stood before the full-length mirror, studying the woman looking back at me. At 38, I still looked relatively young, though stress had added lines around my eyes that hadn't been there when I'd met Kevin 15 years ago. My dark hair was neatly styled, my clothes coordinated and appropriate for a successful developer's wife. But my eyes looked haunted, uncertain, like someone who'd lost faith in her own perception of reality. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Hanging in Kevin's section of our walk-in closet was a navy blue suit, with the tags still attached. Not charcoal gray, navy blue, expensive, clearly new and never worn. I stood frozen, staring at those tags, my mind racing. If Kevin had bought a navy suit recently, why was he wearing a charcoal gray one this morning, while claiming we'd shopped for it together? Why would he lie about something so trivial and easily disproven? Unless it wasn't trivial. Unless this was part of a larger pattern I'd been too confused and self-doubting to recognize. For the first time in months, I felt my nursing instincts kick in. When a patient's symptoms didn't match their reported condition, you investigated further. When stories didn't align with observable evidence, you documented everything and looked for patterns. I had been so focused on questioning my own sanity that I'd stopped applying the critical thinking skills that had defined my professional life. I grabbed my phone and took a photo of the navy suit with its tags. Then I went back to Kevin's bathroom counter, where he claimed I'd left 3 pills yesterday. The counter was spotless, as it always was. Kevin was meticulously neat, almost obsessively so. If there had been pills scattered here yesterday, there would be some trace. A water ring, a slight disarray in his precisely arranged toiletries. There was nothing. I opened the medicine cabinet and found my prescription bottle exactly where I always kept it. I counted the pills inside, then cross-referenced the count with the date the prescription was filled. The math was perfect. I hadn't missed a single dose. Kevin had lied about the pills. He had lied about the suit. How many other lies had I accepted because I'd been conditioned to doubt myself? I spent the next hour going through our house with new eyes, documenting inconsistencies with my phone camera. The anniversary card Kevin claimed I'd never given him was tucked inside his nightstand drawer, still in the envelope with my handwriting. The restaurant reservation I supposedly forgot to make was confirmed in my email with a timestamp showing I'd booked it 3 weeks in advance. The keys to my car, which Kevin said I'd misplaced in my increasing confusion, were hanging on his keychain in his home office. By noon, I had 17 photos documenting lies Kevin had told me in just the past month. Lies designed to make me question my memory, my judgment, my basic competence. This wasn't mental illness or medication side effects. This was deliberate psychological manipulation. I sat in my home office, surrounded by the evidence of Kevin's deception, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity. The fog of self-doubt that had clouded my thinking for so long began to lift, replaced by the sharp focus I remembered from my nursing days. Kevin wasn't trying to help me manage mental health issues, he was creating them. But why? What did Kevin gain by making me believe I was losing my mind? The answer came to me as I remembered a conversation we'd had 6 months ago, right around the time my episodes had intensified. Kevin had been frustrated about a prenuptial agreement his lawyer had recommended for his business partner's protection. If something happened to me, he'd said, or if you ever became incapacitated, the business could be in jeopardy. Maybe we should consider updating our wills and medical directives. At the time, I'd agreed to sign whatever legal documents he thought were necessary. I trusted him completely and had no interest in the complex details of his real estate empire. But now, looking back with clearer eyes, I realized Kevin had been laying groundwork. If I was declared mentally incompetent, he would have complete control over our joint assets, our daughter, and any legal decisions affecting our family. I was still processing this revelation when my phone rang. Dr. Foster's name appeared on the screen. Lisa. Dr. Foster's voice was warm but professional. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I had some concerns after our last session. How are you feeling today? Actually, I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. I'm feeling clearer than I have in months. Dr. Foster, can I ask you something? In your professional opinion, do my symptoms match typical patterns of the conditions Kevin has suggested I might have? There was a pause. Lisa, that's a complex question. Why do you ask? Because I've started documenting some inconsistencies in my daily life, and I'm wondering if my problems might have an external cause rather than an internal one. Another pause, longer this time. Lisa, I'd like to schedule an additional session with you this week. Can you come in tomorrow morning? And Lisa, bring any documentation you've been keeping. I think we need to have a very thorough conversation. After hanging up with Dr. Foster, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life. I opened my laptop and began typing a detailed account of everything I'd discovered, complete with timestamps and photo evidence. If Kevin was systematically gaslighting me, then I would systematically document it. I might have given up my nursing career, but I hadn't lost the skills that made me good at it. I was deep in this documentation when I heard Kevin's car in the driveway, 3 hours earlier than usual. I quickly saved my work to a secure cloud account and closed the laptop, arranging myself in the living room with a book, trying to look like the confused, dependent wife he expected to find. Kevin burst through the front door with an energy I hadn't seen in months, his face flushed with excitement. Lisa, the presentation was incredible. The investors are ready to move forward with the full development. We're talking about a $50 million project. That's wonderful, I said, genuinely pleased despite everything. Kevin's success had always been important to our family's security, regardless of his personal failings. You must be thrilled. There's just one small complication. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kevin continued, loosening his tie as he sat beside me on the couch. The investors want to restructure some of our legal arrangements to protect their investment. Nothing major, just some updates to our estate planning and business documents. I felt ice form in my stomach. What kind of updates? Kevin's expression shifted to that familiar patient concern. Well, given your recent health challenges, they're concerned about having a stable legal framework if your condition worsens. They want to ensure I have clear authority to make decisions for our family and the business without any complications. Kevin, I said carefully, what exactly are you asking me to sign? Just some medical directives and business documents. My lawyer has already reviewed everything. It's really just a formality, but the investors won't move forward without these protections in place. Kevin reached for my hand, his thumb stroking my knuckles in what was supposed to be a reassuring gesture. I know legal documents can be overwhelming when you're not feeling well, so I've arranged for everything to be simplified. You just need to initial a few pages. The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired its precision. Kevin was using my supposed mental health issues to justify taking legal control of our assets, and he was framing it as protection for me rather than a betrayal of me. If I hadn't discovered his lies this morning, I probably would have signed whatever he put in front of me. I'd like to read through everything carefully before I sign, I said, keeping my voice mild and agreeable. Maybe have Dr. Foster review the medical aspects to make sure I understand them correctly. Kevin's grip on my hand tightened slightly. Sweetheart, that's not really necessary. Dr. Foster isn't a lawyer, and these documents are fairly standard. Besides, the investors need everything finalized by Friday. Then we have plenty of time, I replied. It's only Wednesday. For just a moment, Kevin's mask slipped. I saw a flash of irritation, quickly covered by renewed patience. Lisa, I need you to trust me on this. Your confusion about simple things has been getting worse, and I'm worried that trying to understand complex legal language might be overwhelming for you right now. There it was again. The gentle suggestion that I was too mentally fragile to handle adult responsibilities. The implication that my concerns were symptoms of illness rather than rational responses to suspicious circumstances. I understand your concern, I said, extracting my hand from his grip, but I'd still like to review everything myself. I'm sure Dr. Foster would agree that being involved in important decisions is probably good for my confidence. Kevin studied my face for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling that he was recalibrating his approach. Of course, he said finally. I'll have my lawyer prepare copies for you to review, but Lisa, please don't mention this to anyone else yet. The investors value discretion, and premature disclosure could jeopardize the entire deal. After Kevin went upstairs to change, I sat alone in our living room and realized I was no longer fighting just for my sanity. I was fighting for my freedom, my daughter's future, and possibly my life. Kevin wasn't just gaslighting me. He was preparing to have me declared incompetent so he could control everything I'd brought to our marriage. What Kevin didn't know was that I'd already started fighting back. And unlike him, I had documentation to prove every single thing I was about to claim. That evening, I called my old nursing supervisor from the hospital. Maria Rodriguez had been my mentor when I was a new graduate, and she'd tried repeatedly to convince me not to leave when Kevin's business started taking off. Lisa! Maria's voice was delighted. I was just thinking about you yesterday. How are you doing? Maria, I need some advice, and I need you to keep this conversation confidential for now. I took a deep breath. If someone was trying to make you believe you were mentally unstable, what would be the most effective way to document your actual mental state? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Lisa, Maria said finally, her voice careful, are you in danger? I think I might be, I admitted. Not physical danger, but legal and financial danger. And Maria? I think I've been letting myself be convinced I was sick when I was actually being manipulated. Where are you right now? Are you safe to talk? I looked toward the stairs, where I could hear Kevin on a phone call in his office. For now, yes. Okay. First thing tomorrow, you need to see a doctor independently and get a complete mental health evaluation, someone Kevin doesn't know and hasn't chosen. Second, you need to start documenting everything with timestamps and witnesses when possible. And Lisa, you need to trust your instincts. The Lisa Martinez I knew was one of the sharpest nurses I ever supervised. That person doesn't just disappear. After we hung up, I went to check on Sophie, who was doing homework in her room. My 12-year-old daughter looked up as I knocked on her doorframe, and I was struck by how careful her expression was. When had Sophie learned to guard her words around me? Hey, baby, I said, settling on the edge of her bed. How was school today? It was okay, Sophie said, but her eyes flickered toward the hallway where Kevin's voice was still audible from his office. Sophie, I said gently, can I ask you something? Last week, when Dad said I forgot to pick you up from soccer practice, do you remember exactly what happened? Sophie's face went through a complex series of expressions: confusion, discomfort, and something that looked almost like relief. Mom, she said quietly, you didn't forget to pick me up. You were there right on time, like always. But when Dad asked me about it later, I thought maybe I was remembering wrong. My heart broke a little. Kevin had been manipulating Sophie too, making her doubt her own memories to support his narrative about my mental state. You weren't remembering wrong, sweetheart, I told her. Your memory is just fine, but I need you to do me a favor and not mention this conversation to Dad, okay? There are some grown-up things I need to figure out first. Sophie nodded solemnly, and I could see the relief in her eyes at having her perceptions validated. That night, after Kevin fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and planning my next moves. I would see an independent psychiatrist tomorrow for a comprehensive evaluation. I would meet with a lawyer Kevin didn't know to understand my legal rights. And I would continue documenting every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to undermine my reality. Kevin had spent 3 years trying to convince me I was mentally unstable. Tomorrow I would begin proving that I was sharper, stronger, and more determined than he had ever imagined. And when I was done, the judge's reaction to my evidence would ensure that Kevin lost everything he thought he'd so cleverly maneuvered to control. I had no idea that in 18 months I'd be sitting in a courtroom listening to Kevin tell a judge I was mentally unstable, while I held a folder containing proof that would destroy his life as thoroughly as he'd tried to destroy mine. But that night, for the first time in years, I fell asleep with hope instead of confusion, knowing that the woman Kevin thought he'd broken was about to show him exactly how much fight she had left. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, Austin's typical February weather that matched my mood as I prepared for what felt like the most important day of my life. Kevin had left early for another investor meeting, kissing my forehead with that same practiced affection, while reminding me to take it easy and not overthink things. If he only knew that overthinking was exactly what I planned to do. My first appointment was with Dr. Patricia Williams, a family attorney whose name I'd found through the Texas State Bar website. I'd specifically chosen someone with no connections to Kevin's business circle, someone who specialized in cases involving psychological manipulation and financial abuse. Her office was in a modest building, near the University of Texas campus, far from the gleaming downtown towers where Kevin conducted his business. Dr. Williams was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to see everything. Her office was lined with law books and family photos, creating an atmosphere that was both professional and reassuring. She listened without interruption as I explained my situation, occasionally taking notes but mostly watching my face with the intensity of someone trained to spot deception. "Mrs. Martinez," she said when I finished, "what you're describing sounds like a textbook case of psychological abuse designed to establish grounds for incompetency proceedings. Have you seen any legal documents that might support this theory?" "Not yet," I admitted. "Kevin mentioned papers he wants me to sign, but he's been vague about the details. He says it's for his business investors, but now I'm wondering if there's more to it." Dr. Williams leaned back in her chair, her expression serious. In Texas, declaring someone mentally incompetent requires significant legal proceedings and medical evidence. However, if your husband has been systematically documenting what he claims are episodes of confusion or irrational behavior, and if he has medical professionals who support his claims, he could potentially petition for guardianship. The word guardianship hit me like a physical blow. What would that mean? Complete legal control over your finances, medical decisions, and living arrangements. You would essentially become a legal minor under his care. Dr. Williams' voice was gentle but clear. "The good news is that competency challenges require substantial proof, and from our conversation today you demonstrate clear thinking, excellent recall, and sophisticated understanding of complex situations. The bad news is that if he's been planning this for years, he may have already assembled what appears to be compelling evidence." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I'd taken yesterday. "What if I have evidence that he's been lying about these episodes?" Dr. Williams examined each image carefully, asking detailed questions about the timeline and context. "This is excellent documentation, Mrs. Martinez. But we need to be strategic about how we use it. If your husband is planning legal action, we need to be prepared with our own case." "What kind of case?" "Divorce proceedings with evidence of psychological abuse and fraud. If we can prove that he's been deliberately manipulating you to gain control of marital assets, any documents you signed under duress could be invalidated." She paused, studying my face. "Mrs. Martinez, what assets are we talking about? What would your husband gain by having you declared incompetent?" This was the question I'd been dreading, because I wasn't entirely sure of the answer. "I don't know the full extent of our finances," I admitted. "Kevin handles all the business matters. I know we have the house, some investment properties, and his development company, but I've never seen detailed financial statements." Dr. Williams made more notes. "We need to get you a complete picture of your marital assets before we proceed. I'm going to refer you to a forensic accountant who specializes in cases like this. In the meantime, I want you to document everything you can remember about your financial contributions to the marriage, any family money or assets you brought to the relationship, and any instances where Kevin might have used your name or signature on business documents." As I drove home from Dr. Williams' office, My mind was racing with memories I'd been too confused to properly examine. When Kevin and I got married 15 years ago, I'd had a modest inheritance from my grandparents, about $80,000 that I'd contributed toward the down payment on our first house. I'd also used my excellent credit and stable nursing income to co-sign for Kevin's initial business loans when banks were reluctant to lend to a new developer with limited collateral. More troubling, I remembered signing numerous documents over the years that Kevin assured me were routine business paperwork or tax documents. I'd trusted him completely and never read anything carefully, assuming that as his wife, his success was our success. Now I wondered what I'd actually been signing. My second appointment was with Dr. Amanda Foster, and this time I approached our session with entirely different expectations. Instead of seeking help for my supposed mental health issues, I was looking for professional validation of my sanity, and possibly an ally in exposing Kevin's manipulation. Dr. Foster's office was in a medical complex near downtown Austin, decorated in soothing blues and greens, with comfortable furniture that invited honest conversation. I'd been seeing her for 6 months, but today felt like our first real meeting. "Lisa," Dr. Foster said as I settled into my usual chair, "you sounded different on the phone yesterday. More focused. How are you feeling?" "Dr. Foster, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. In your professional opinion, do I show signs of the mental health conditions my husband has suggested I might have?" Dr. Foster was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. "Lisa, I've been troubled by some inconsistencies in your case since we began working together. Your cognitive function, memory, and reasoning abilities all test within normal ranges. Your responses to psychological evaluations don't support diagnoses of dementia, psychosis, or severe depression. Yet you've reported experiencing symptoms that would typically correlate with those conditions. What if I told you that I've discovered evidence that my husband has been lying about situations he's claimed I forgot or misunderstood?" Dr. Foster's expression shifted from professional caution to sharp attention. "Show me." I spent the next hour walking Dr. Foster through my documentation, explaining each instance where Kevin's version of events contradicted physical evidence. She listened intently, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated her growing understanding of the pattern. "Lisa," she said finally, "what you're describing is a form of psychological abuse called gaslighting. It's designed to make victims doubt their own perceptions and memories, often as a way to establish control." She paused, her professional demeanor giving way to something more personal. "I have to tell you, I've been concerned about your case because your reported symptoms were inconsistent with my observations of your mental state. This explains a great deal. Would you be willing to testify to that if necessary?" "Absolutely. In fact, I'm ethically obligated to report suspected psychological abuse." Dr. Foster was already reaching for her files. "Lisa, I want to conduct a comprehensive psychological evaluation today. With your permission. We'll document your actual mental state with standardized tests and formal assessments. If legal proceedings become necessary, this evaluation could be crucial evidence." The evaluation took 3 hours and covered everything from memory tests to psychological assessments to cognitive function measures. By the end, I was mentally exhausted, but oddly exhilarated. For the first time in years, I was being evaluated by someone who believed my perceptions were valid. "Lisa," Dr. Foster said as we concluded, "your test results show cognitive function in the superior range, excellent memory, and no indicators of mental illness or incompetency. You're one of the psychologically healthiest people I've evaluated in months." I actually laughed, a sound that surprised us both. 6 months ago, I was convinced I was losing my mind. 6 months ago, someone was working very hard to convince you of that, Dr. Foster replied grimly. "The question now is what we do with this information." That evening, Kevin returned home with a briefcase full of documents and an expression of barely contained excitement. He'd been making phone calls all afternoon, and I'd heard fragments of conversation about finalizing arrangements and securing the marriage future. "Lisa, sweetheart," he said, settling beside me on the couch with the briefcase balanced on his knees. "I have the documents I mentioned yesterday. My lawyer has simplified everything so you won't be overwhelmed by legal language." He opened the briefcase and removed a stack of papers that looked far more complex than anything that could be called simplified. "These are just updates to our estate planning and some business restructuring documents." The investors require certain protections, and frankly, given your recent health challenges, I think it's wise to have clear legal frameworks in place. I accepted the papers and began reading carefully, using every skill I'd developed as a nurse for interpreting complex medical documents. What I found made my blood run cold. The first document was a durable power of attorney that would give Kevin complete control over my financial and legal affairs, effective immediately upon my signature. The language was broad enough to allow him to sell property, access accounts, and make investment decisions without my input or consent. The second document was a medical power of attorney that would give Kevin authority over all my healthcare decisions, including the ability to commit me to psychiatric treatment against my will. The third document was something called a competency agreement that acknowledged my ongoing mental health challenges and my voluntary surrender of certain legal responsibilities to ensure family stability. Kevin, I said, keeping my voice steady, this power of attorney is quite broad. It would give you control over all our assets, wouldn't it? Kevin's expression shifted to that familiar patient concern. Only if something happened to you, sweetheart. It's just a precaution, like having insurance. The investors need to know that business decisions can be made efficiently if you're having one of your difficult periods. And this medical power of attorney would allow you to make decisions about psychiatric treatment? Only if you were unable to make rational decisions yourself, Kevin said, his tone suggesting this was perfectly reasonable. Lisa, you've been struggling with confusion and memory issues. If there was a crisis, I need to be able to get you the help you need quickly. I continued reading, noting clause after clause that would essentially strip me of all legal autonomy, while positioning Kevin as my protective caretaker. Kevin, I'm not comfortable signing these today. I'd like to have an attorney review them first. The change in Kevin's demeanor was immediate and startling. The patient concern vanished, replaced by sharp irritation. Lisa, we've discussed this. The investors need these documents filed by Friday. Your paranoia about routine legal paperwork is exactly the kind of irrational behavior these documents are designed to address. Wanting legal review of documents that affect my rights isn't paranoia, Kevin. It's common sense. Kevin stood abruptly, pacing to the window with jerky movements that betrayed his agitation. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Lisa. 6 months ago, you would have trusted me to handle these details. Now you're questioning everything, seeing conspiracies where none exist. Do you understand how exhausting it is to live with someone who treats every normal business decision like a personal attack? The manipulation was so practiced, so smooth, that I almost felt myself wavering. But then I remembered Dr. Foster's evaluation, Dr. Williams' warnings, and the evidence I'd documented of Kevin's lies. I'm not questioning your business decisions, Kevin. I'm exercising my right to understand legal documents before I sign them. If the investors really need these by Friday, then we have time for proper review. Kevin turned from the window, and for a moment his mask slipped completely. I saw cold calculation in his eyes, fury at my unexpected resistance, and something that looked almost like fear. Fine, he said, through gritted teeth. Have them reviewed. But Lisa, if this paranoid behavior costs us this opportunity, if your mental health issues sabotage our family's future, there will be consequences. The threat was barely veiled, and it crystallized something I'd been avoiding acknowledging. Kevin wasn't just trying to control me, he was threatening me. And if he was threatening me, then I was in far more danger than I'd realized. After Kevin stormed upstairs, I photographed every page of the documents, uploaded them to my secure cloud account, and sent copies to Dr. Williams with a message. Urgent review needed. Husband demanding signature by Friday and becoming hostile about my request for legal review. Her response came within an hour. Do not sign anything. These documents would give him complete control over your life. Emergency meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. That night, I lay awake listening to Kevin's breathing beside me, and realized I was sharing a bed with someone who had been systematically plotting to steal my autonomy for years. The man I'd married, the father of my daughter, had been implementing a long-term plan to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could control whatever assets I'd contributed to our marriage. But what really kept me awake was a growing suspicion that Kevin's plan was more advanced than I'd realized. If he was pressuring me to sign these documents now, with investor meetings and business deals as justification, then something had accelerated his timeline. Something had made it urgent for him to gain legal control over me immediately. The next morning, I met Dr. Williams at her office before Kevin woke up, bringing printed copies of all the documents he'd presented. She reviewed them with the forensic accountant she'd recommended, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in financial fraud cases. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Chen said after examining the papers, "these documents would give your husband access to everything you own, including assets he might not currently control. Do you have any investments, inheritance, or property that's solely in your name?" "I don't think so," I said, then stopped. "Actually, I'm not sure. Kevin has always handled our finances, and I've never seen comprehensive statements." Dr. Williams and Dr. Chen exchanged a look that made my stomach clench. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Williams said gently, "we need to run a complete asset search. If your husband is this eager to gain control over your legal rights, there may be assets you're not aware of that are currently protected under your name." The asset search took most of the day and revealed information that left me speechless. My inheritance from my grandparents hadn't just been used for our first house down payment. It had been invested in a trust that had grown to over $400,000. My name was on the deed to 2 rental properties Kevin claimed to own outright. I was listed as a 50% owner of Martinez Development Group, Kevin's company, despite having no memory of signing ownership documents. Most shocking of all, there was a life insurance policy on me worth $2 million, taken out just 18 months ago, right around the time my supposed mental health episodes had begun. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Chen said as she reviewed the final reports, "your husband has been using your assets and credit to build his business empire while maintaining legal structures that keep you as a primary owner or beneficiary. If he gained guardianship over you, he would control everything, including the life insurance policy." Dr. Williams was studying the insurance documents with a grim expression. "Lisa, this policy was taken out during the period when Kevin claims your mental health was deteriorating. The timing is extremely suspicious." I felt sick. "You think he's planning to have me committed? Or worse, I think he's planning to gain complete control over you and your assets through legal means if possible," Dr. Williams said carefully. "The insurance policy could be coincidental, but combined with everything else, it suggests he's considered multiple scenarios for your future." As I drove home that afternoon, my mind was reeling with the scope of Kevin's deception. He hadn't just been gaslighting me to undermine my confidence. He'd been building a financial empire using my assets while positioning himself to take complete control through guardianship proceedings. And if guardianship didn't work, the life insurance policy suggested he'd considered even more permanent solutions. But Kevin had made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed that 3 years of psychological manipulation would leave me too broken and confused to fight back. He'd counted on my self-doubt and isolation to prevent me from seeking help or questioning his narrative. What he hadn't anticipated was that my nursing background had given me skills he couldn't break: the ability to observe patterns, document evidence, and think critically under pressure. He'd also underestimated my capacity for strategic thinking when properly motivated. That evening, Kevin came home with flowers and wine, his mood apparently improved from his hostility the night before. "I'm sorry about yesterday," he said, kissing my cheek as he handed me the bouquet. "I know the legal documents are stressful. Maybe we could talk about them over dinner." I accepted the flowers with a smile that felt foreign on my face. "That would be nice. I've been thinking about what you said, and I want to understand how these documents protect our family." Kevin's relief was visible. "I knew you'd see reason once you had time to process everything. You've always been so smart, Lisa. These episodes don't change that." As Kevin opened the wine and began explaining why the documents were necessary for our financial security, I nodded and asked thoughtful questions while secretly recording everything on my phone. Every word he spoke was being documented, every lie preserved as evidence. Kevin thought he was convincing his confused, mentally unstable wife to sign away her rights. In reality, he was providing testimony that would be used against him in court. Because what Kevin still didn't understand was that the mentally unstable woman he'd spent 3 years creating no longer existed. In her place was someone far more dangerous to his plans, a woman who remembered exactly who she used to be. The following week became a masterclass in covert investigation. While Kevin believed I was finally coming around to signing his documents, I was actually building the most comprehensive case of fraud and psychological abuse that Dr. Williams had ever seen. Every morning after Kevin left for work, I transformed from the confused, dependent wife he expected into someone I barely recognized, a woman with a mission and the skills to accomplish it. My first breakthrough came when I decided to visit Kevin's office unannounced. Martinez Development Group occupied the entire 15th floor of a downtown Austin high-rise, with Kevin's corner office offering panoramic views of the city he claimed to be conquering. His assistant, Jennifer, had always been friendly during my rare visits, but today I approached her with a specific purpose. "Hi, Jennifer," I said, carrying a small gift bag with Kevin's forgotten lunch inside. Kevin left this at home, and I know how cranky he gets when his blood sugar drops. Jennifer laughed, accepting the bag with genuine warmth. "Oh, you're so thoughtful, Mrs. Martinez. He's been incredibly stressed lately with all these new investor meetings. Between you and me, I've never seen him work this hard on a single deal." I settled into one of the chairs facing her desk, projecting the casual chattiness Kevin always said made me seem scattered. "He mentioned something about restructuring documents for the investors. It sounds so complicated." "Oh my goodness, yes," Jennifer replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "The lawyers have been here almost every day for the past month, and that forensic accountant Kevin hired has been going through everything with a fine-tooth comb." My blood chilled. Forensic accountant? Some woman from Dallas. Kevin said the investors required a complete financial audit before they'd commit to the Lake Travis project. Jennifer glanced around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Honestly, between you and me, I think Kevin's been stressed because they're looking into personal finances too, not just business accounts." I managed to keep my expression neutral while my mind raced. Kevin had hired a forensic accountant to examine our finances before I'd even discovered his deception. He'd been preparing for this move far longer than I'd realized. "Well, I should let you get back to work," I said, standing with what I hoped looked like casual disinterest. "Oh, and Jennifer, Kevin mentioned you might need to work late this week preparing documents. I was going to surprise him with dinner reservations Friday night, but maybe I should wait until this big deal is finished?" Jennifer checked her computer screen. "Actually, Friday should be perfect. Kevin's calendar is completely clear after 2 p.m. He's been saying he wanted to spend more time with you and Sophie once this project wraps up." As I rode the elevator down from Kevin's office, I processed what Jennifer had unknowingly revealed. Kevin had cleared his Friday afternoon, which happened to be his deadline for my signature on those documents. He'd hired a forensic accountant to examine our personal finances, and he'd been planning this investor deal for at least a month, which meant his timeline wasn't being driven by external pressure but by his own strategic planning. My next stop was the Travis County Clerk's office, where I requested copies of all documents filed under both Kevin's name and mine. What I discovered there painted an even more disturbing picture of systematic deception. Over the past 2 years, Kevin had filed numerous business documents listing me as a partner or co-owner, apparently using my signature from other contexts. My name appeared on property transfers, business licenses, and loan applications I'd never seen. Most troubling, there were several documents dated from periods when Kevin claimed I was having severe memory episodes, yet my signature appeared normal and confident on each page. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Susan, noticed my confusion as I reviewed the files. "Is everything all right, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm having trouble remembering signing some of these documents," I said carefully. "Is there any way to verify when they were actually signed?" Susan examined several of the papers with professional interest. "Well, some of these have notary stamps with dates and times. And this one here has a witness signature. If you're concerned about forgery, you might want to have a handwriting expert examine them." I photographed every document, noting inconsistencies in notary stamps and witness signatures. Several documents showed the same witness signature despite being filed months apart, and one notary stamp appeared to have been altered. Kevin hadn't just been manipulating me psychologically. He'd been committing document fraud to establish legal ownership of assets I didn't even know we possessed. That afternoon, I met with Dr. Williams and Dr. Chen to review my findings. Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly grim as she examined the county records. Mrs. Martinez, what you've uncovered suggests a sophisticated financial fraud scheme, Dr. Chen said. Your husband has been using your legal identity to establish business entities and acquire assets, while simultaneously building a case for your mental incompetency. It's actually quite clever from a criminal perspective. Dr. Williams was studying the notary stamps through a magnifying glass. Several of these documents show clear signs of fraud. The notary dates don't match the filing dates, and these witness signatures are obviously forged. We need to contact the district attorney's office. What does that mean? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the scope of what Kevin had been planning. It means your husband has been committing multiple felonies, Dr. Williams replied. Document fraud, identity theft, possibly money laundering through shell companies established in your name. This goes far beyond psychological abuse or even civil fraud. We're looking at serious criminal activity. Dr. Chen had been running calculations on her laptop while we talked. Mrs. Martinez, based on these documents and the asset search we conducted, your husband has been using your legal identity to accumulate nearly $3 million in assets and business interests. If he succeeded in having you declared incompetent, he would gain control of everything, while you would be powerless to challenge his actions. The magnitude of Kevin's betrayal was staggering. This wasn't just a husband trying to control his wife. This was a criminal enterprise built on stolen identity and psychological abuse. I thought about Sophie, about the years of confusion and self-doubt, about the careful way Kevin had isolated me from friends and professional networks. Every piece of his behavior now made horrible sense. What do we do now? I asked. We build an airtight case, Dr. Williams said. But we need more evidence of his psychological manipulation, and we need to understand his timeline. If he's planning to file incompetency proceedings soon, we need to be ready with criminal charges that will stop him cold. That evening, I returned home with a new appreciation for the danger I was facing. Kevin wasn't just emotionally abusive. He was a criminal who had spent years building an elaborate scheme to steal my identity and assets. The life insurance policy suddenly took on an even more sinister meaning. Kevin was in his home office when I arrived, speaking on the phone in low, urgent tones. I caught fragments of conversation about finalizing everything by Friday and making sure there are no complications. When he saw me, he quickly ended the call and greeted me with his usual performance of concerned affection. "How was your day, sweetheart?" he asked, kissing my forehead while his eyes searched my face for signs of suspicion. "Quiet," I replied. "I spent some time thinking about those documents you want me to sign. I have a few questions, but nothing major." Kevin's relief was visible. "I'm glad you're feeling more comfortable with everything. What questions can I answer?" I pulled out a notebook where I'd written several innocuous-sounding questions designed to get Kevin to elaborate on his plans. "Well, this power of attorney document is quite comprehensive. Would it allow you to make decisions about my medical treatment, even if I disagreed with your choices?" "Only if you were unable to make rational decisions yourself," Kevin replied smoothly. "Lisa, you've been having episodes where you don't remember conversations or events. If your condition worsened to the point where you couldn't understand treatment options, I would need legal authority to get you the help you need. What kind of treatment are you thinking about?" Kevin's pause was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. "Well, that would depend on what medical professionals recommended. Possibly residential treatment, if your memory issues became severe enough to pose a safety risk. Residential treatment." Kevin was already planning to have me committed to a psychiatric facility, where I would be completely under his control and unable to challenge his legal maneuvering. "And this business restructuring document," I continued, consulting my notes. "It mentions transferring certain assets to ensure operational continuity. What assets specifically?" "Just some of the properties and business interests that are currently in both our names," Kevin said. "The investors want clean title structures without any potential complications from personal issues." "Personal issues?" Kevin's expression shifted to that familiar patient concern. "Lisa, if your condition deteriorated to the point where you couldn't participate in business decisions, Having everything tied up in joint ownership could paralyze the company. This just ensures that important decisions can be made efficiently. What Kevin was describing was the systematic theft of everything I owned, justified by a mental health condition he'd manufactured through years of psychological abuse. But I nodded thoughtfully, as if his explanation was helping me understand rather than horrifying me. "That makes sense," I said. "I suppose I'm just nervous about such major changes." "I understand completely," Kevin replied, moving closer and taking my hands in his. "But Lisa, I need you to trust me on this. These documents protect our family's future, and the investors won't move forward without them. If we miss this opportunity because of paperwork delays, it could destroy everything we've built together." The manipulation was flawless, combining emotional appeals with veiled threats and time pressure. If I hadn't already understood Kevin's true nature, I probably would have signed everything just to ease the tension. "Okay," I said softly. "I'll sign them tomorrow." Kevin's smile was radiant with triumph. "Thank you, sweetheart. I know this has been stressful, but you're doing the right thing for our family." That night, while Kevin slept beside me, I activated the recording app on my phone and placed it carefully on my nightstand. I'd been documenting our conversations for weeks, but tonight felt especially important. Kevin often talked in his sleep when he was stressed, and I had a feeling his subconscious might reveal information his waking mind kept hidden. I was right. Around 2 a.m., Kevin began mumbling in his sleep, fragments of conversations and concerns spilling out in disjointed sentences. Most of it was unintelligible, but I caught several phrases that made my blood run cold. "She'll never figure it out," "residential facility by summer," and most chilling of all, "insurance payout solves everything." I lay awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling and processing the implications. Kevin wasn't just planning to have me committed. He was planning for me to die in that facility, whether through neglect, medication complications, or more direct means. The life insurance policy wasn't just financial protection, it was his exit strategy. The next morning, I called Dr. Williams as soon as Kevin left for work. "We need to accelerate our timeline," I told her. "I think Kevin is planning to have me committed this week, and I don't think he expects me to survive the experience." Dr. Williams' response was immediate. "Come to my office now. We're filing criminal charges today." The district attorney's office was an imposing concrete building downtown, all sharp angles and government efficiency. Dr. Williams had arranged for us to meet with ADA Sarah Chen, a prosecutor who specialized in financial crimes and domestic abuse cases. Ada Chen was a small woman with steel in her spine and eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Martinez," Ada Chen said after reviewing our evidence, "what you've documented is one of the most sophisticated cases of psychological abuse and financial fraud I've encountered. Your husband has essentially been conducting a years-long criminal enterprise using your identity." She spread the documents across her conference table, pointing to patterns of fraud and manipulation that painted a comprehensive picture of Kevin's scheme. Document forgery, identity theft, financial fraud, psychological abuse designed to facilitate legal kidnapping through false incompetency proceedings, and potentially conspiracy to commit murder given the life insurance policy and his comments about residential facilities. "What happens now?" I asked. "We arrest him," Ada Chen said simply, "but we need to do this carefully. If your husband suspects we're onto him, he might accelerate his timeline or take desperate action. I want you to go through with signing those documents today, but we'll have undercover officers monitoring everything. The moment he files those papers or takes any action to have you committed, we'll have him." Dr. Williams looked concerned. "Is it safe for Lisa to remain in that house?" "We'll have surveillance on the property starting immediately," Ada Chen assured her. "Mrs. Martinez, you're going to help us catch your husband in the act of attempting to steal your life. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Sophie, about the years of confusion and self-doubt, about all the other women Kevin might target if he wasn't stopped. "I'm ready." The plan was elegantly simple. I would sign Kevin's documents as promised, but Dr. Williams would file a preemptive motion declaring them fraudulent and obtained under duress. The moment Kevin tried to use those documents to initiate guardianship proceedings or commit me to a psychiatric facility, he would be arrested for multiple felonies. Meanwhile, Adia Chen's team would be gathering additional evidence, including surveillance footage from Kevin's office building, phone records showing his conversations with the mysterious forensic accountant, and financial records proving the money laundering schemes hidden within his business operations. That afternoon, I returned home to find Kevin pacing nervously in our living room, the briefcase of documents open on our coffee table. His relief when he saw me was palpable. "Lisa, thank God," he said, embracing me with what felt like genuine emotion. "I was worried you might be having second thoughts." "No second thoughts," I replied, settling beside him on the couch. "I trust you, Kevin. You've always taken care of our family." Kevin's hands trembled slightly as he handed me the first document. Whether from excitement or nervousness, I couldn't tell. "Just initial each page and sign at the bottom," he instructed. "My lawyer has already reviewed everything." As I signed each document, Kevin watched intently, occasionally offering reassuring comments about how these papers would protect our future. What he didn't know was that hidden cameras were recording everything, and that each signature I made was being documented as evidence of his fraud. When I finished signing the last page, Kevin gathered the documents with obvious relief. "Thank you, sweetheart. You've done the right thing for our family." "What happens now?" I asked. "I'll file these with my lawyer tomorrow morning," Kevin said. "Then we can finally move forward with the investor deal and stop worrying about all these legal complications." But Kevin's timeline was about to be interrupted in ways he never could have anticipated. Because while he'd been planning to steal my life, I'd been planning to save it. And tomorrow morning, when he tried to file those fraudulent documents, he would discover that the mentally unstable woman he thought he'd been manipulating had been 3 steps ahead of him all along. As Kevin celebrated his apparent victory with an expensive bottle of wine, I smiled and played the grateful wife while mentally counting down the hours until his arrest. The man who had spent 3 years convincing me I was losing my mind was about to discover that I'd never been more clear-headed in my life. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp February sunshine that made Austin feel full of possibilities. Kevin woke early, humming while he showered and dressed in his most expensive suit. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, as he prepared for what he believed would be the day he finally gained complete control over my life and assets. "Big day today," he said, kissing my forehead as he gathered the briefcase containing my signed documents. "By this afternoon, everything will be settled and we can move forward with our future." I smiled from our bed, playing the role of the trusting wife one final time. "I'm proud of you, Kevin. You've worked so hard for this opportunity." Kevin's expression softened with what looked like genuine affection, and for a moment I glimpsed the man I'd married 15 years ago. "We've worked hard, Lisa. This success belongs to both of us." The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Kevin was finally acknowledging my contributions to our marriage, just hours before he planned to steal everything I'd helped build. After Kevin left, I had 45 minutes before I needed to be at the courthouse for our scheduled hearing. Adia Chen had moved with impressive speed, obtaining emergency orders and assembling a prosecutorial team that would present our case to Judge Patricia Morrison, a family court judge known for her sharp intellect and intolerance for manipulation. I dressed carefully in a navy blue dress that conveyed competence without ostentation, styling my hair in a simple bun that suggested professionalism. Every detail mattered today. Kevin had spent 3 years painting me as mentally unstable and increasingly incompetent. My appearance needed to contradict his narrative before I even spoke. Dr. Williams met me at the courthouse entrance, along with Dr. Foster and Dr. Chen, who would serve as expert witnesses. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Williams asked as we walked through security. "Nervous," I admitted, "but ready. Kevin has no idea what's about to happen, does he?" "None whatsoever," Dr. Williams confirmed. "He's probably at his lawyer's office right now, attempting to file guardianship papers that will trigger his arrest warrant the moment he presents them." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wooden benches that could seat perhaps 50 people and tall windows that let in streams of morning light. Judge Morrison was already at her bench, reviewing files while her bailiff organized exhibits. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of untangling complex family disputes. At precisely 9 a.m., the doors opened and Kevin entered with his attorney, a silver-haired man named Robert Harrison, who specialized in estate planning and probate law. Kevin's confidence was evident in his posture, his stride, his satisfied smile as he spotted me at the plaintiff's table. He probably thought I was there to support his guardianship petition. Kevin's expression shifted to confusion when he saw Dr. Williams, Dr. Foster, and Dr. Chen seated beside me, each with thick folders of documents. The confusion deepened when he noticed Adia Chen conferring with Judge Morrison, and when he saw the court reporter and stenographer preparing to document every word of our proceeding. "What's going on?" Kevin whispered urgently to his attorney, who looked equally perplexed. Judge Morrison called the court to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling chaotic situations. "This is an emergency hearing in the matter of Martinez versus Martinez, case number 2024 FC 8847. We're here today to address allegations of psychological abuse, financial fraud, and attempted guardianship fraud." Kevin's face went pale. "Your Honor," his attorney interjected, "we're here to file guardianship papers for Mrs. Martinez, who has been experiencing severe mental health issues. We weren't notified of any counter-allegations." "Mr. Harrison," Judge Morrison replied coolly, "your client won't be filing anything today. In fact, as of 30 minutes ago, your client is under arrest for multiple felonies related to the very guardianship you were planning to request." The words hit Kevin like a physical blow. He spun around to look at me, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been admiration. "Lisa," he said quietly, "what have you done?" Judge Morrison's gavel silenced any further conversation. "Mr. Martinez, you are not to address the plaintiff directly. Adia Chen, please present your case." Adia Chen rose with the controlled energy of a prosecutor who knew she had an airtight case. "Your Honor, what we're presenting today is one of the most sophisticated cases of psychological abuse and financial fraud this court has ever seen. The defendant, Kevin Martinez, has spent 3 years systematically convincing his wife that she was mentally unstable while simultaneously using her identity to commit multiple felonies. She approached the bench with a thick folder of evidence. The defendant hired forensic accountants to examine assets that legally belonged to his wife, forged her signature on numerous business documents, established shell companies using her identity, and took out a $2 million life insurance policy while building a case for her mental incompetency. Kevin's attorney looked stunned. "Your Honor, this is the first we're hearing of these allegations. My client has been caring for his mentally ill wife for years." "Has he?" Adia Chen replied. "Dr. Amanda Foster, please take the stand." Dr. Foster moved to the witness stand with professional composure, her credentials impressive even in this formal setting. Under Adia Chen's questioning, evidence of mental illness. Adia Chen's cross-examination was devastating. She walked Kevin through each piece of evidence, forcing him to explain the forged signatures, the fraudulent business documents, and the insurance policy he'd taken out during my supposed mental decline. "Mr. Martinez," Adia Chen said, holding up a property transfer document, "can you explain why your wife's signature appears on this document dated last June, when you testified that she was experiencing severe memory problems during that period?" Kevin's pause was telling. "She has good days and bad days. That must have been a good day. Yet you didn't think her mental state was stable enough to read the document before signing it?" "I was protecting her from stress. By having her sign legal documents without reading them?" Kevin's answers became increasingly defensive and contradictory. Adia Chen methodically dismantled his credibility, using his own words against him, and exposing the calculated nature of his scheme. The most damaging moment came when Adia Chen played the recording I'd made of Kevin talking in his sleep. His unconscious references to residential facilities and insurance payouts filled the courtroom, and I watched his face crumble as he realized how thoroughly he'd been caught. "Mr. Martinez," Adia Chen said after the recording ended, "can you explain these references to your wife's death and insurance payouts?" "I don't remember saying those things," Kevin replied weakly. "Are you claiming you were mentally unstable when you made these statements?" The irony of the question wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Kevin was being forced to either admit to planning my death or claim mental instability himself. Judge Morrison called a brief recess to review the evidence, and during those 30 minutes, I watched Kevin's world completely unravel. His attorney was making urgent phone calls, probably trying to arrange bail for the criminal charges that were coming. Kevin himself sat alone at the defendant's table, staring at the documents that proved his guilt. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and comprehensive. "Mr. Martinez," she began, "the evidence presented today demonstrates a pattern of psychological abuse, financial fraud, and criminal conspiracy that this court finds deeply disturbing. The guardianship petition you intended to file is hereby denied and declared fraudulent," she continued, her voice growing stern. "Furthermore, this court finds that you have systematically abused your wife's trust, forged her signature on numerous legal documents, and used her identity to commit felonies. Your attempts to have Mrs. Martinez declared mentally incompetent appear to be motivated entirely by criminal intent." Kevin's shoulders sagged as Judge Morrison continued. "Effective immediately, you are prohibited from accessing any accounts, properties, or business entities that belong to Mrs. Martinez. The court is also granting Mrs. Martinez exclusive use of the family home and primary custody of your minor daughter." But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "Mr. Martinez, your behavior represents one of the most calculated cases of psychological abuse this court has encountered. You didn't just steal money, you attempted to steal your wife's sanity, her autonomy, and ultimately her life. This court has no tolerance for such manipulation." The criminal charges were read aloud: multiple counts of forgery, identity theft, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit kidnapping through false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder. Kevin's bail was set at $500,000, with strict conditions prohibiting any contact with me or Sophie. As the bailiff moved to escort Kevin from the courtroom, he turned to look at me one final time. "Lisa," he said quietly, "I underestimated you." "Yes," I replied, my voice steady and clear. "You did." Judge Morrison's final words echoed in the suddenly quiet courtroom. "Mrs. Martinez, this court recognizes your courage in exposing this abuse and your strength in reclaiming your life. You are clearly a woman of exceptional mental competence and methodically destroyed Kevin's narrative about my mental health. Mrs. Martinez demonstrates cognitive function in the superior range," Dr. Foster testified. "Her memory, reasoning abilities, and psychological profile all fall within completely normal parameters. In fact, she's one of the most psychologically healthy individuals I've evaluated in recent months." "But she was referred to you for memory problems and confusion, correct?" Ada Chen asked. "She was referred by her husband, who claimed she was experiencing episodes of disorientation and memory loss. However, every incident she reported could be explained by external manipulation rather than internal dysfunction. What Mrs. Martinez was experiencing was gaslighting, not mental illness." Kevin's attorney attempted to cross-examine Dr. Foster, but her testimony was unshakable. She had documentation of every session, formal psychological evaluations, and expert opinions that completely contradicted Kevin's claims about my mental state. Dr. Chen testified next, presenting the financial evidence we'd uncovered. "The defendant has been using Mrs. Martinez's identity to establish business entities worth nearly $3 million, she explained to the court. He forged her signature on property transfers, business licenses, and loan applications, while simultaneously building a case that she was too mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs." Judge Morrison examined each document carefully, her expression growing increasingly stern. "Dr. Chen, in your professional opinion, could these financial maneuvers have been accomplished without sophisticated planning?" "Absolutely not, Your Honor. This level of identity fraud requires extensive preparation and criminal intent. The defendant has been implementing this scheme for at least 2 years. When it was time for me to testify, I approached the witness stand with steady steps and clear eyes. Kevin watched my every movement, perhaps finally seeing me as I truly was, rather than the broken woman he'd tried to create. Under Dr. Williams' questioning, I presented my evidence chronologically, starting with the small inconsistencies I'd noticed, and building to the comprehensive case of fraud and abuse we'd uncovered. I showed the court photographs of Kevin's lies, audio recordings of his manipulation, and documentation of every instance where he'd undermined my reality. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Williams asked, "when you discovered evidence that your husband had been lying about routine events, how did that affect your perception of your own mental health?" "It was like waking up from a 3-year nightmare," I replied. I'd been convinced I was losing my mind, but suddenly I realized my mind was fine. It was my environment that was toxic. "And how did you feel when you discovered the extent of your husband's financial fraud?" "Betrayed, certainly, but also determined to ensure he couldn't do this to anyone else. Kevin didn't just steal money. He stole years of my life by making me doubt my own sanity." Kevin's attorney cross-examined me aggressively, trying to paint me as a vindictive wife seeking revenge through false accusations. But my testimony was calm, detailed, and supported by overwhelming evidence. Every question he asked gave me another opportunity to demonstrate the mental clarity and competence that Kevin had claimed I lacked. When Kevin finally took the stand in his own defense, the transformation in his demeanor was striking. Gone was the confident businessman who'd entered the courtroom. In his place was a man who clearly understood that his carefully constructed scheme was collapsing around him. "Your Honor," Kevin began, his voice lacking its usual authority, "my wife is mentally unstable. She's been documenting our private conversations, taking secret recordings, and frankly, I fear for our daughter's safety living with someone so paranoid and delusional." The words hung in the air like an accusation, but Judge Morrison's expression suggested she was unimpressed by Kevin's characterization of my investigative work as emotional resilience. As Kevin was led away in handcuffs, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I'd been carrying for 3 years. The man who had tried to convince the world I was mentally unstable had just been exposed as a criminal whose elaborate scheme had been unraveled by the very woman he'd underestimated. Walking out of that courthouse, surrounded by the legal team that had helped me reclaim my life, I realized that Kevin's greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating my intelligence or my investigative skills. His greatest mistake had been forgetting that I was a nurse who had spent years saving lives under pressure. And when my own life was threatened, those same skills had saved me. The afternoon news coverage was extensive, with reporters describing the case as one of the most sophisticated psychological abuse schemes prosecuted in Travis County. Kevin's business empire was already crumbling as investors learned about his criminal activities, and several of his business partners were distancing themselves from Martinez Development Group. But for me, the most important victory wasn't financial or legal. It was the moment Sophie hugged me after school and said, "Mom, I always knew you weren't crazy. I'm glad everyone else knows it now, too." Kevin had spent 3 years trying to destroy my mind, my confidence, and my life. Instead, he'd made me stronger, smarter, and more determined than I'd ever been. And now, finally, I was free to show the world exactly who Lisa Martinez really was. Part 5. 6 months after Kevin's conviction, I stood in the executive conference room of what was now Martinez Foster Healthcare Solutions, looking out at the Austin skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected a woman I barely recognized. The transformation wasn't just in my appearance, though the confidence in my posture and the clarity in my eyes would have been impossible for Kevin to manipulate. The real change was deeper, fundamental, as if 3 years of imposed confusion had been replaced by an unshakable certainty about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The business Kevin had built using my stolen identity had collapsed within weeks of his arrest. Investors fled, partners dissolved their agreements, and the Lake Travis development project that was supposed to secure our future became the subject of multiple lawsuits. But from those ashes, something remarkable had emerged. Dr. Amanda Foster and I had formed a partnership that combined my healthcare background with her mental health expertise, creating a company that provided psychological support services for abuse survivors, while also consulting with legal teams on cases involving psychological manipulation. The irony wasn't lost on me that Kevin's attempt to destroy my sanity had led me to a career helping other people reclaim theirs. Our first major contract came from the Travis County District Attorney's Office, which hired us to evaluate victims in cases similar to mine. Within 3 months, we'd expanded to serve 3 counties, and our waiting list extended into the following year. The morning light streaming through those conference room windows illuminated folders containing 18 active cases, each representing a woman whose reality had been systematically distorted by someone she trusted. The patterns were disturbingly consistent across cases, reinforcing my growing understanding that Kevin's tactics weren't unique innovations, but rather variations on themes employed by manipulators throughout history. My assistant knocked on the conference room door, interrupting my morning review of case files. "Mrs. Martinez, your 10 o'clock appointment is here. Maria Santos from the Henderson case." Maria Santos was 28 years old with dark circles under her eyes and the careful way of moving that I recognized from my own recent past. She'd been referred by Adia Chen after her husband was arrested for financial fraud and psychological abuse, remarkably similar to Kevin's methods. Her case was still pending trial, and she was struggling with the same self-doubt and confusion that had nearly destroyed me. "Maria," I said, greeting her with a warm handshake, "I'm so glad you decided to come in today. How are you holding up?" Maria's smile was fragile but genuine. "Better than last week. My attorney says you went through something similar to what I'm experiencing. Is that true?" I settled into the chair across from her, noting how she positioned herself near the door, maintaining an escape route even in what should have been a safe space. "It's true. My ex-husband spent 3 years convincing me I was mentally unstable while he systematically stole my identity and assets. The psychological manipulation was so effective that I genuinely believed I was losing my mind." "How did you figure out what was really happening?" Maria asked, leaning forward slightly. "I started documenting inconsistencies instead of accepting his explanations for them," I replied. When someone tells you that you forgot a conversation or misplaced something, but you find evidence that contradicts their version of events, that's not memory loss. That's manipulation. Over the next hour, I walked Maria through the same process I'd used to reclaim my sanity and my life. We discussed documentation strategies, how to recognize gaslighting techniques, and most importantly, how to trust her own perceptions even when everyone around her suggested they were flawed. Maria's case involved a husband who'd convinced her that her accounting degree was worthless, that her job performance was declining due to memory problems, and that she needed his guidance to make even basic financial decisions. "The hardest part," Maria admitted as our session progressed, "is that sometimes I still doubt myself. Even knowing what he did, part of me wonders if I really am as confused and unreliable as he claimed." "That's normal," I assured her. "Psychological abuse creates neural pathways that don't disappear overnight. But every time you choose to trust your own observations over someone else's manipulation, you strengthen your ability to distinguish between reality and distortion. It takes practice, but it gets easier." Maria pulled out a notebook filled with her own documentation efforts. "I've been keeping track like you suggested. Yesterday he claimed I forgot to pay the electric bill, but I found the confirmation email from 2 weeks ago. He also said I never told him about my sister's birthday party, but I have text messages proving I mentioned it 3 times. "Excellent work," I said, examining her notes. "What you're documenting isn't evidence of memory problems. It's evidence of systematic deception designed to make you question your own competence." After Maria left, I spent an hour updating her case file and coordinating with her legal team. Her husband had used many of the same tactics Kevin employed, but Maria's case was moving more quickly through the system because prosecutors now had a template for recognizing and proving psychological abuse. Kevin's conviction had established legal precedents that were helping other victims find justice. The patterns I was seeing across cases suggested something more disturbing than individual abusers developing similar tactics independently. The techniques were too specific, too sophisticated, and too consistently applied to be coincidental. 3 different women had reported husbands who used almost identical language to describe their supposed memory problems. 2 others had been convinced they were developing early-onset dementia using remarkably similar psychological pressure campaigns. Dr. Foster arrived for our weekly business meeting carrying her own stack of case files and wearing the focused expression that indicated she'd made important connections. "Lisa," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, I've been analyzing the psychological profiles from our current cases, and I'm seeing patterns that suggest these men didn't develop their tactics in isolation. What kind of patterns? The progression of manipulation follows almost identical timelines across multiple cases. First, they establish credibility by being helpful and protective. Then they begin undermining their wives' confidence in small ways that seem caring rather than controlling. Finally, they escalate to medical concerns that justify taking control of finances and decision-making. Dr. Foster spread several case summaries across my desk, pointing to similarities that were indeed striking. More concerning, 3 of our clients report their husbands attending the same men's group at a community center in North Austin. The group was supposedly for professional development, but the timing coincides with the beginning of psychological manipulation in each case. This information aligned with suspicions I'd been developing based on my own investigation into Kevin's activities. During our marriage, he'd attended regular evening meetings that he claimed were real estate investor gatherings. I'd never questioned these meetings, accepting his explanation that networking was essential for his business success. Now I wondered if those meetings had served a different purpose entirely. "Do we have enough information to contact law enforcement?" I asked. "I think so. Ada Chen has been asking about potential connections between cases, and this gives us something concrete to investigate." Our conversation was interrupted by my assistant announcing an unscheduled visitor. Detective Sarah Kim from the Dallas Police Department was waiting in our lobby, requesting an urgent meeting about developments in the Rebecca Chen case I'd been consulting on. Detective Kim entered my office with the focused energy of someone who'd uncovered information that changed everything about an investigation. "Mrs. Martinez, we've made some discoveries about your ex-husband's activities that you need to know about immediately." She opened a briefcase containing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be computer printouts. "We've been investigating Rebecca Chen's husband, and we found evidence of communication between him and your ex-husband dating back 4 years. They weren't just using similar tactics, they were sharing information and coordinating their activities." The photograph showed printouts of email exchanges between Kevin and at least 6 other men, discussing what they termed wife management strategies and, quote, asset protection through competency planning. The language was clinical and detached, treating wives as problems to be solved, rather than people to be respected. "Mrs. Martinez," Detective Kim continued, "we believe your ex-husband was part of an organized network that developed and shared psychological manipulation techniques specifically designed to facilitate financial fraud through false incompetency claims." The scope of Kevin's deception was even broader than I'd imagined. Not only had he systematically abused me for his own financial gain, but he'd been part of a criminal enterprise that was victimizing women across multiple states. The techniques that had nearly destroyed my sanity were being refined and distributed to other predators looking for sophisticated methods to control their wives. "How many victims are we talking about?" I asked. "At least 12 confirmed cases across 5 states, possibly more. The network appears to have been operating for at least 7 years, with your ex-husband as one of the primary coordinators." Detective Kim explained that federal investigators were now involved, treating this as a racketeering case that crossed state lines and involved multiple conspirators. Kevin's sentence would likely be extended significantly as additional charges were filed, and several other men were facing arrest warrants based on evidence uncovered through their communications. "Mrs. Martinez, your documentation and testimony were crucial in establishing the patterns that led us to this broader investigation. Without your case, we might never have recognized this as organized criminal activity, rather than isolated domestic abuse." After Detective Kim left, I sat alone in my office processing the implications of what I'd learned. Kevin hadn't just stolen from me. He'd been operating a criminal enterprise that treated wives as assets, to be manipulated and plundered. The 3 years of confusion and self-doubt I'd experienced were the result of techniques that had been tested, refined, and shared among men who viewed psychological abuse as a business strategy. But rather than feeling overwhelmed by this revelation, I felt energized. Every case our company handled was potentially connected to this broader network, which meant our work was helping to expose and prosecute a criminal conspiracy that might otherwise have continued victimizing women indefinitely. My lunch appointment was with Sophie, who had adapted to our new life with the resilience that seemed to define her generation. At 13, she was thriving in a way that would have been impossible while living under Kevin's manipulation. Her grades had improved dramatically once she no longer had to navigate the confusion of supporting her father's lies while protecting her mother's sanity. We met at a cafe near her school, where Sophie ordered a sandwich and immediately launched into a detailed account of her science project on cognitive psychology. "Mom, did you know that gaslighting actually changes brain chemistry? The stress hormones from constantly questioning your own perceptions can cause measurable changes in memory and decision-making centers." I smiled at her enthusiasm for a subject that had once been a source of family trauma. "That's fascinating, sweetheart. What made you choose that topic?" Sophie's expression became more serious. "I wanted to understand what Dad did to you, and I wanted to prove scientifically that you were never crazy, even when I was too scared to say so." Her research had led her to discover academic studies on psychological abuse that validated everything we'd experienced. She'd learned about the neurological impact of chronic stress, the way manipulative relationships rewire neural pathways, and the biological mechanisms that make gaslighting so effective. "I also wanted to understand why I felt so confused during those years," Sophie continued. "I knew Dad was lying about things, but I didn't know why or how to process what was happening." The conversation shifted to lighter topics as we discussed her upcoming birthday and summer plans. But I was struck by how mature and insightful she'd become. Living through Kevin's manipulation had forced her to develop sophisticated analytical skills at a young age, and she was channeling those abilities into academic pursuits that genuinely excited her. "Mom," Sophie said as we prepared to leave, "I'm proud of what you've built with Dr. Foster. You're helping people the way you used to help patients in the hospital, just in a different way." Her words stayed with me as I returned to the office for an afternoon meeting with potential investors interested in expanding our services statewide. The business model we'd developed was apparently unique enough to attract significant attention from venture capital firms specializing in healthcare innovations. The lead investor, Patricia Wellington, was a woman in her 60s who'd built her reputation by identifying companies that addressed underserved market needs. She arrived with 2 associates and a briefcase full of documents that suggested they'd conducted extensive research into our company and the broader market for psychological abuse support services. "Mrs. Martinez," Patricia said as we reviewed our financial projections, "what you and Dr. Foster have created fills a gap that most people didn't even realize existed. Psychological abuse cases are increasing nationwide, but there are virtually no specialized services for victims or support systems for legal teams handling these complex cases." "The need is definitely there," I agreed. "We're receiving referrals from 5 states now, and most victims have never had access to professionals who understand the specific dynamics of psychological manipulation." Patricia's associates asked detailed questions about our methodology, success rates, and plans for scaling our services. They were particularly interested in our training programs for law enforcement and legal professionals, which had proven surprisingly popular among agencies that had previously struggled to recognize and prosecute psychological abuse cases. "Your personal experience obviously informed the development of these services," Patricia said, "but what qualifies you to scale this into a major healthcare initiative?" It was a fair question that went to the heart of my transformation over the past year. My background as a registered nurse gave me skills in assessment, documentation, and crisis intervention that proved essential in my own case, I explained. But more importantly, surviving psychological abuse taught me to recognize patterns of manipulation that aren't obvious to people who haven't experienced them personally. That combination of professional training and lived experience creates insights that can't be replicated through traditional education alone. The meeting concluded with Patricia's firm committing to lead a funding round that would allow us to establish offices in Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio within the next 18 months. As I signed the preliminary agreements, I thought about the contrast between this moment and the fraudulent documents Kevin had pressured me to sign less than a year ago. Now I was building something meaningful with my own vision and expertise, rather than having my identity stolen to support someone else's criminal enterprise. That evening, I attended a support group meeting for survivors of psychological abuse, held in the community center near my home. The group had formed organically as word spread about my case and the services we were providing. What started as informal conversations among women who'd experienced similar manipulation had evolved into a structured support network that met twice weekly. Tonight's discussion focused on rebuilding trust in personal relationships after experiencing systematic deception. The 12 women in attendance ranged in age from 25 to 62, representing diverse backgrounds united by the common experience of having their reality distorted by people they'd trusted. "I've been divorced for 8 months," shared Jennifer, a real estate agent whose ex-husband had convinced her she was incompetent at her job. "But I still second-guess every decision I make. How do you learn to trust your own judgment again?" The question resonated with everyone in the circle. I thought about my own journey from confusion to clarity, remembering the small steps that had gradually rebuilt my confidence. "For me," I said, "it started with documenting small things and then verifying my perceptions independently. When I noticed that Kevin was lying about routine events, I began taking photos and keeping records. Seeing objective evidence that my memories were accurate helped me trust my other observations." "But what about bigger decisions?" asked Carol, whose husband had controlled their finances while convincing her she was too emotional to handle money responsibly. "I'm terrified of making mistakes that will prove he was right about my incompetence." "The difference," I replied, "is that you're asking that question from a place of wanting to make good decisions, not from a place of believing you're inherently incapable. Someone who was truly incompetent wouldn't be concerned about their decision-making abilities." A newer member of the group, Sandra, had been attending for only 3 weeks after discovering that her husband had been drugging her coffee with mild sedatives, while telling everyone she was becoming increasingly confused and forgetful. "I keep wondering if I'll ever feel normal again," she said quietly. "Some days I feel strong and clear, but other days I still doubt everything." "Recovery isn't linear," I assured her. "There will be setbacks and moments of doubt. But each time you choose to trust your own perceptions over someone else's manipulation, you strengthen those neural pathways. The brain is remarkably adaptable, and you can literally rewire the damage that psychological abuse created." The group discussion continued for another hour, with each woman sharing strategies that had helped her reclaim confidence and autonomy. What struck me most was how similar their experiences were to mine, despite the different specific tactics their abusers had employed. The patterns of manipulation were remarkably consistent across cases, which reinforced my conviction that our business model could help victims nationwide. After the meeting, several women stayed to help clean up and continue conversations that had started during the formal session. These informal moments often produced the most valuable insights, as women felt more comfortable sharing details they weren't ready to discuss in the larger group. "Lisa," said Margaret, whose husband had convinced her she was developing dementia at age 55. "I wanted to thank you for sharing Detective Kim's information about the network. My attorney thinks my ex-husband might have been connected to the same group." This wasn't the first time I'd heard this possibility raised. As more details emerged about Kevin's criminal network, several women in our support group had recognized similarities to their own experiences that suggested broader connections. "Have you seen any evidence of communication between your ex-husband and other men about manipulation tactics?" I asked. "Actually, yes. He used to attend monthly meetings that he claimed were for business networking, but now I'm wondering if they served a different purpose. The timing coincides with when he started undermining my confidence about my job performance." Margaret's revelation aligned with patterns we were seeing across multiple cases. The more I learned about this network, the more sophisticated and widespread it appeared to be. These men hadn't stumbled onto effective manipulation techniques independently. They'd been sharing information and refining their methods through organized collaboration. As I drove home from the support group meeting, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed. The house that had once felt like an elegant prison now truly belonged to me, both legally and emotionally. I'd redecorated extensively, removing the formal perfection Kevin had preferred and replacing it with comfort and functionality that reflected my actual preferences, rather than his image management. Sophie was doing homework in the kitchen when I arrived, surrounded by textbooks and notebooks in organized chaos that would have driven Kevin to distraction. She looked up as I entered, her face brightening with genuine affection, rather than the careful politeness she'd maintained during the worst years of Kevin's psychological manipulation. "How was group tonight?" she asked, pausing in her algebra homework. "Productive. We're seeing more women develop confidence in their own judgment, which is really the ultimate goal." I settled beside her at the kitchen table, noting how comfortable and natural this felt, compared to the formal dinner conversations Kevin had orchestrated to maintain appearances. "Mom," Sophie said, her expression becoming more serious, "can I ask you something about Dad?" This was still difficult territory, balancing honesty about Kevin's crimes with Sophie's need to process her relationship with her father. "Of course. Do you think he ever actually loved us, or was it all manipulation?" I considered the question carefully, remembering moments of apparent genuine affection mixed with calculated deception. "I think your father is capable of love, but only in ways that serve his own interests. His feelings for us were real within the limits of what he's psychologically capable of experiencing. The problem was that those limits made him willing to hurt us whenever his interest conflicted with our well-being." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. It explains why some of my memories with him feel good, but I was always walking on eggshells around him too." These conversations were helping both of us understand our experiences without excusing Kevin's behavior or minimizing the damage he'd caused. Sophie was developing a sophisticated understanding of complex human psychology that would serve her well throughout her life. The phone rang as we were finishing our discussion, displaying a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something prompted me to answer. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Detective Sarah Kim with the Dallas Police Department. I'm calling about a case that might be connected to your ex-husband's activities." My attention sharpened immediately. Kevin was serving a 10-year sentence for his crimes against me, but investigators had suspected his methods were too sophisticated to have been developed for a single victim. "What kind of connection?" I asked. "We're investigating a case involving psychological abuse and financial fraud that follows almost exactly the same pattern as your ex-husband's crimes. The victim's attorney suggested we contact you because the similarities are too specific to be coincidental." Detective Kim explained that a woman named Rebecca Chen had been convinced by her husband that she was developing early-onset dementia, while he simultaneously used her identity to establish business entities and accumulate assets. The timeline suggested that Rebecca's husband had begun his scheme while Kevin was still manipulating me, raising the possibility that they'd shared information or methods. "Mrs. Martinez," Detective Kim continued, "would you be willing to consult on this case? Your expertise in recognizing these manipulation patterns could be invaluable in building our prosecution." I agreed immediately, recognizing this as an opportunity to help another victim, while potentially uncovering a broader network of psychological abuse. If Kevin had been part of a group that shared tactics for manipulating wives, there might be other victims who hadn't yet recognized what had been done to them. The following week, I flew to Dallas to meet with Rebecca Chen and review the evidence in her case. The similarities to my own experience were chilling and undeniable. Rebecca's husband had used almost identical language to convince her that her memory was failing, had forged her signature on the same types of documents Kevin had falsified, and had even taken out a similar life insurance policy during the period of her supposed mental decline. "Mrs. Martinez," Rebecca said during our first meeting, "I can't tell you what it means to meet someone who understands exactly what I've been through. Everyone keeps asking how I didn't realize what was happening, but you know how convincing they can be." Rebecca was a successful marketing executive who'd built a consulting firm that generated substantial revenue. Her husband had systematically undermined her confidence in her professional abilities while positioning himself as her protector and advisor. The financial documents I reviewed showed a pattern of asset transfer remarkably similar to what Kevin had attempted with my resources. Working with Rebecca's case reminded me of my own journey from confusion to clarity, but also highlighted how much I'd grown in confidence and analytical ability. I could now recognize manipulation tactics that would have fooled me a year ago, and I had the professional framework to help other victims develop the same skills. The Dallas investigation eventually uncovered evidence of a loose network of men who'd shared information about psychological manipulation techniques through online forums and private communications. Kevin hadn't invented his methods in isolation. He'd been part of a community that treated wives as targets for sophisticated cons designed to steal their identities and assets. Mrs. Martinez, Detective Kim explained during one of our consultations, "We've found chat logs and email exchanges going back 5 years. Your ex-husband was apparently considered an expert in what they called, quote, competency planning, systematically undermining a wife's credibility to justify taking control of her assets. The chat logs were disturbing in their clinical detachment. These men discussed their wives' psychological vulnerabilities, the way other people might analyze stock investments or real estate opportunities. They shared strategies for creating confusion, techniques for isolating wives from support networks, and methods for documenting behavior that could be used to support incompetency claims. What's particularly concerning," Detective Kim continued, "is that they were also sharing information about which medical professionals and legal advisors were most likely to support their narratives without asking difficult questions." This revelation explained why Kevin had been so confident about the documents he'd wanted me to sign. He'd known exactly which professionals to approach and what language to use to make his case seem reasonable and protective rather than predatory. The federal investigation that grew out of these discoveries eventually identified 43 men across 12 states who had participated in what prosecutors termed a psychological abuse conspiracy. The scope was staggering, representing hundreds of victims who had been systematically manipulated using refined techniques that had been tested and shared across the network. 6 months later, I received a letter that brought my transformation full circle. It was from Kevin, written from the federal prison where he was serving his sentence. The envelope had been forwarded through multiple attorneys, as his contact with me was still restricted by court order. I debated whether to read it, ultimately deciding that curiosity outweighed any potential emotional damage. Kevin's handwriting was as precise as ever, his words carefully chosen to project repentance while subtly attempting to minimize his crimes. "Lisa," the letter began, "I've had time to reflect on my actions and their impact on you and Sophie. While I disagree with some aspects of the court's findings, I recognize that I made serious errors in judgment that caused you pain. I hope you can eventually find it in your heart to forgive me." The letter continued in that vein for 2 pages, acknowledging responsibility while characterizing his systematic psychological abuse as errors in judgment and, quote, communication problems. Even from prison, Kevin couldn't resist the urge to manipulate language in ways that minimized his culpability. More troubling was a section where Kevin claimed that his participation in online forums was merely seeking advice for dealing with what he genuinely believed were my mental health issues. He portrayed himself as a confused husband looking for guidance, rather than a criminal collaborating with other predators to refine manipulation techniques. But what struck me most about the letter wasn't Kevin's continued manipulation. That was entirely predictable. What struck me was my complete lack of emotional response to his words. Reading his attempts at manipulation felt like watching someone try to perform magic tricks after you'd learned how they worked. The techniques that had once controlled my reality now seemed transparent and ineffective. I showed the letter to Dr. Foster during our weekly business meeting, curious about her professional assessment of Kevin's psychological state. "This is actually quite typical," she explained after reading it carefully. "Abusers often interpret their conviction and imprisonment as evidence that they're the real victims. Kevin probably genuinely believes he's being unfairly punished for what he considers minor relationship issues." "Should I respond?" I asked. "Only if you want to, and only if doing so serves your interests rather than his," Dr. Foster replied. "But Lisa, the fact that you're asking that question analytically rather than emotionally tells me how far you've come. A year ago, you would have agonized over whether refusing to respond made you a bad person." She was right. The woman who'd been manipulated into signing away her autonomy would have felt guilty about not forgiving Kevin immediately. The woman I'd become could evaluate his letter objectively and make decisions based on my own needs rather than his emotional manipulation. I chose not to respond to Kevin's letter, filing it away as a reminder of how far I'd traveled from the confused, self-doubting person he'd tried to create. Instead, I focused my energy on the work that had given my life new meaning and purpose. Our company had grown to employ 28 people across 6 offices, providing services that hadn't existed when I needed them most. We'd helped prosecute 67 cases of psychological abuse, secured favorable legal outcomes for dozens of victims, and developed training programs that were being implemented by law enforcement agencies nationwide. The training programs had become a significant revenue source and were creating systemic change in how psychological abuse was recognized and prosecuted. Police departments that completed our training reported a threefold increase in successful prosecution of psychological manipulation cases, largely because officers learned to recognize patterns of behavior that had previously been dismissed as relationship conflicts. But perhaps most importantly, we'd created a community of survivors who understood that healing from psychological abuse required more than just escaping the immediate situation. It required rebuilding fundamental trust in one's own perceptions, developing new frameworks for evaluating relationships, and learning to recognize manipulation tactics that might be employed by future predators. On the first anniversary of Kevin's conviction, I organized a celebration dinner for the support group that had formed around my case. 37 women attended, representing various stages of recovery from psychological abuse. Some were recently divorced and still struggling with self-doubt. Others had rebuilt their lives completely and were helping newer members navigate their own healing processes. A year ago, I said as we raised our glasses in a toast, most of us believed we were mentally unstable, incompetent, or fundamentally flawed. Tonight, we're celebrating our collective strength, intelligence, and resilience. We've proven that recovery from psychological abuse isn't just possible. It can make us stronger than we ever imagined. The dinner conversation was filled with laughter, success stories, and plans for the future that would have been impossible when we were isolated in abusive relationships. These women had become more than clients or group members. They were friends, colleagues, and collaborators in a movement that was changing how society understood and responded to psychological manipulation. Several women had started their own businesses or returned to careers they'd abandoned during their abusive relationships. Others had become advocates, speaking at conferences and training sessions to help professionals recognize the signs of psychological abuse. The ripple effects of our collective healing were creating positive change far beyond our immediate community. "Lisa," said Patricia, one of the original group members, "I wanted you to know that I've been accepted to law school. I'm planning to specialize in cases involving psychological abuse and financial fraud." Similar announcements filled the evening as women shared their achievements and future plans. The transformation was remarkable, not just in individual lives, but in the collective power these women had discovered through supporting each other's recovery. As I drove home that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Kevin had spent 3 years trying to convince me I was losing my mind, intending to steal my identity, my assets, and ultimately my life. Instead, his manipulation had forced me to develop skills and insights that enabled me to help dozens of other women reclaim their own lives. The investigation into Kevin's network had led to federal charges against 43 men and civil lawsuits on behalf of more than 200 victims. The financial recovery for these women had totaled over $50 million, representing assets that had been stolen through psychological manipulation and fraudulent documentation. More importantly, the precedents established through these cases were making it easier for other victims to seek justice and recover from psychological abuse. Courts were developing expertise in recognizing manipulation tactics, and law enforcement agencies were learning to investigate these cases with the sophistication they required. The woman Kevin had tried to destroy no longer existed, replaced by someone stronger, smarter, and more purposeful than I'd ever been during our marriage. His greatest crime had been not just the psychological abuse or financial fraud, but the years he'd stolen when I could have been using my abilities to make a meaningful difference in the world. But I was making that difference now, one case at a time, one survivor at a time, one court victory at a time. The life Kevin had tried to end had become more valuable and impactful than anything I could have achieved while living under his control. Sophie was waiting up when I got home, eager to hear about the anniversary dinner. As I described the evening's highlights, I was struck by how proud she seemed of what we'd built together in the aftermath of Kevin's betrayal. "Mom," she said as we were saying goodnight, "I know what Dad did was terrible, but in a weird way, I'm glad it happened. Not the pain he caused you, but the way you used that experience to help other people. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing." Looking back at the woman I'd been a year ago, confused, isolated, doubting her own sanity. I could barely recognize her as the same person who now stood in this house that truly belonged to me, surrounded by meaningful work and genuine relationships built on honesty rather than manipulation. Kevin had called me mentally unstable in front of a judge, confident that his characterization would be accepted without question. The judge's reaction to my evidence had indeed made Kevin lose everything: his freedom, his assets, his reputation, and his power to hurt anyone else. But more than that, the judge's recognition of my mental competence and emotional resilience had validated what I'd always known but had been convinced to doubt. I was stronger, smarter, and more capable than anyone had ever given me credit for. And now, finally, I was free to prove it every single day. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.